All right, students, welcome to class. Today we're going to be discussing Unit 14 and Unit 15, in which Unit 14 will be survey research and Unit 15 will be observational research. So we're going to start off with survey research, and what I'd like to talk about today is I'm just going to give you a quick disclaimer about survey research in general. Then we'll discuss the importance of question formats, emphasize construct validity, which we talked about before, and how that relates to question wording. And additionally, understand biases formed from participant responses, which biases, as you know, is one of my favorite words. I bring it up over and over again. We're going to discuss how biases even come into survey research as well. I wanted to start off with this disclaimer. We will not cover every aspect of survey research during this lecture. In fact, when we get to observational research, we won't be covering everything about observational research either. I will, however, encourage you to take a survey design class sometime in your career, especially if you're getting into the psychological sciences. Surveys are a big deal in psychological sciences, and understanding everything that relates to surveys and all of the methodologies that go along with surveys is a huge, great thing to know for your career path and to understand it, and it can help you with any job opportunity. There's tons of materials on surveys and so much to learn about them. I can only talk about so much at a time. I've taken a couple survey design classes in my life, and I certainly loved every aspect of them, and it's one of my favorite subjects. So, given that, this is really just going to be a brief overview of survey design and survey methodologies. Let's start off defining our construct of interest, which is survey research. So survey research is a method of posing questions to people via some formats. That can be via phone formats or in person or using a pen and paper. And we always have to ask ourselves, is simply asking questions a valid form of research? And really, yeah, it is. People are generally honest in their responses in survey research, but it depends on how well you ask these questions. And additionally, we'll talk later too about the sensitivity associated with surveys as well, and how that can sway participant responses to be truthful, non-truthful, or give you some true meaning of reliability and validity within your studies. So the first thing that we need to talk about in survey research is your question format in general. There's two types of question formats. There's open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. And within closed-ended questions, we have three different types of closed-ended questions. Those are forced choice questions, Likert scales, and semantic differential formats. So starting off with open-ended questions, all these are is a question, or as I like to call them at other times, items, in which we allow respondents to answer in any way they like. So essentially, you're leaving this question open-ended for the individual. So a couple examples of open-ended questions is, please tell us about your hotel experience. Or additionally, tell me about your relationship with your supervisor. Notice how they're technically not even questions. They're actually statements that you expect the individual to respond to. Now these leave the individual the availability and the freedom to respond in any way they like to. And that's essentially what an open-ended question is some sort of statement or question that the participant that's taking your survey is allowed to answer in any way freely that they like to. Think about this. When you ask someone how their hotel experience is, there's so many different possibilities of answers. You can get someone who's pretty short-winded and who just says it was a good experience, or you can get someone who's pretty heated and have a long description of why they hated their hotel experience and essentially tell you about all the things that went wrong or good, whatever it is. All this is, to have an open-ended question, all you need is to provide the participant the ability to provide any free range of response that they would like to your question or statement. So one large advantage of open-ended questions is that you get all of the information you need from the participants. So whether that's just a one-word statement of good or if that's a long paragraph, the nice thing is there's a plethora of information associated with these open-ended questions. However, a large disadvantage of open-ended questions and why you don't see them as much in survey research is that they're hard to code and hard to analyze. And what I mean when I say I want to code them is simply, how do I take a paragraph statement and put that into some sort of numeric form so I can statistically analyze what it is? That's the disadvantage of open-ended questions. Although they provide this plethora of information, it's extremely hard to actually analyze it and get some sort of interpretable results. And that's where closed-ended questions come in. Beyond open-ended questions, we also have closed-ended questions, which essentially force your respondent to answer in a way that you've already pre-designated for them. And within these closed-ended questions, there's three different types. The first type, being the one that I'm going to describe in this slide, is a forced choice response question. Essentially, a closed-ended question are those that are only allow for one of two responses that you can choose from, either yes or no, either in the positive or the negative that you can respond in. This does not allow for a neutral response at all. I find that it's oftentimes common in personality measures, where they oftentimes will provide you a statement saying, are you outgoing? And you say yes or no. Are you shy around others? Yes or no. So notice how it doesn't allow for anything in between at all. Either you're all shy or you're all outgoing in some way, in which case this is a forced choice response. So when you think of forced choice responses, think most oftentimes that they're in the binary. There's only one of two responses you can choose from with nothing in between. So an advantage of this is that they're oftentimes easy to score. Did the participant choose yes or no? And that's great, really great from a statistical standpoint to be able to score something easily and get a direct survey response. However, we lose something called variance. We didn't allow the participant to choose within a spectrum anymore, so we lose this variance to understand. Either someone is all yes or they're all no, and we get nothing in between that. Therefore, it's a lot harder from a statistical standpoint to get a true understanding of the variance that people could have chosen. You've essentially partitioned your variance into all yes or all no, as opposed to subsectioning it into smaller cases, which we'll be learning with other closed-ended formats as well. Additionally, something that I've always found whenever I've used this format in survey questions is participants oftentimes don't like the way that forced choice questions work. Participants don't like to be all of one thing or the other. Within these, and I'm sure if you've ever taken a personality measure, you've seen this. You say, well, I'm not always shy. I'm not always outgoing. Therefore, participants are often will complain a lot. So that's something to think about when you are doing this forced choice format. The next type of closed-ended question is Likert scales. And yes, it is pronounced Likert, not Likert, like you hear a lot of people say. I've looked this up. It is definitely Likert. This is probably one of the most important scaling items that you'll learn because psychology uses it so often. Like, I can't get over how often we see Likert scale items within psychological surveys. But I'm sure you've seen these already in the past. I'm sure you've answered many scales with a Likert item on it. But essentially, this is a bipolar ranking of statements that allows participants to indicate some sort of negative or positive degree of agreeance within a statement. So if we look on our left, we get an example of a Likert scale response in which someone can answer between very satisfied to very dissatisfied, with options in between as well, so that participants can actually have some variation in the way that they agree. So essentially, this is like your forced choice question, but with multiple response points. That goes beyond 2. And additionally, it's in a ranking system that allows for participants to rank it from an either very satisfied or very dissatisfied or strongly agree or strongly disagree way of stating their agreement with the item. So one great advantage, and I think this is the reason why psychology loves this so much, is because it allows for that variance in responses. Participants are allowed to make participants are allowed to respond in a way that makes them feel more comfortable. And additionally, we are able to get this understanding of whether there's a difference between someone who's very satisfied or just satisfied in general. And additionally, we can even include a neutral standpoint to see how do people neutral respond to this item. Is there something that's characteristic about people who are more neutral to this item as compared to those who are not neutral or satisfied or dissatisfied, and so on? So it allows us to answer a lot more questions within our research question. However, within the psychological literature, there's a lot of debate as to what the statistical properties are that are associated with Likert scale responses. From my assumption of this class, if you'll remember, we talked about nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales. What happens with Likert scales is there's no true agreement as to whether or not these fit an ordinal level of variables or interval levels of variable. For the purposes of this class, I've decided to make it so that it fits as an interval range of scales because it gives it a little bit better statistical properties. However, if you go into more of the economics literature, you'll often find that they consider these to be ordinal data, which leaves them open to a lot different types of statistical properties associated with them. So in reality, this gives us a lot of broad interpretations as to how we can actually interpret Likert scales in general. But in general, this seems to be the most favored question response format in psychological surveys for the most part. And I'll agree, I enjoy giving this to participants. Participants understand how to rate a Likert scale and additionally how to respond to Likert scales in general. And they generally enjoy ranking things this way on a survey. The next of the closed-ended questions are semantic differential formats. This looks very similar to a Likert scale. However, the difference is in the way that we rank the questions. Instead of using things like agree to disagree or a positive to negative, we use the differences between certain adjectives to rank the differences. So, if you look at your left to the image, you can see that it's when you rate your manager on the following traits, you're using certain adjectives in order to rank them. This can also be bipolar, as in only allowing for two choices as well. However, you get more variation and variance when you allow for the differences to be something like 5 response choices they can choose from as opposed to 2 response choices that they can choose from. So as you can see, on our anchors, we use different adjectival traits such as strong or weak, decisive or indecisive, active or passive, or cheerful and uncheerful. An advantage to this is that it allows the researcher to have a flexible design in the way that they construct their surveys. Meaning that we can construct our surveys, we can analyze it in any way we want to, we can create the adjectives that we like. However, it's very hard to correctly choose appropriate anchoring adjectives, as there might be differences in the way that people define certain words. For example, the differences between strong and weak. There could be other adjectives that might work better than weak or might work in terms of strong instead. So it needs to be agreed upon among everyone of what the correct adjectives are within your semantic differential format of wording questions. So we just previously talked about how to scale questions using the forced choice or the Likert scaling or the semantic differential formatting. However, what's more important is how you word your questions. This has everything to do with our terminology of construct validity. If you remember from a previous lecture where we talked about what construct validity was, where we talked about the differences of convergent and divergent validity, about how well something relates to other variables of interest or how well it does not relate to variables of interest as well. Scaling is indeed important, but really how you word your questions is going to be the most important aspect of any survey because it can make or break a survey if you word it correctly or incorrectly. So I wanted to bring up construct validity again. So remember, let's bring back to what construct validity is. Construct validity is how well our variable of interest is measured. In reality, does it relate to other variables of interest? So if it actually relates to our variables of interest, remember we referred to that as convergent validity. If it relates negatively or has a negative correlation with a variable of interest, we call that divergent validity. So if you look at the image to your left, remember we use this from a previous lecture where we're looking into self-esteem. In reality, self-esteem should positively relate to someone's ability to cope, whereas it should self-esteem should negatively relate with somebody's distrust for friends. And lastly, it should also have no correlation with variables that aren't at all related to it. For example, self-esteem should have a zero correlation with someone's liking for coffee, essentially. So remember, if you don't remember what construct validity is, go back to the previous slideshows where we talked about all the different validity types to get yourself a refresher as to what construct validity is. Because really, the way we word our questions will make or break our construct validity in a survey. So in survey items, we're oftentimes obsessed with construct validity and how it relates to other variables of interest, and wording has everything to do with that. So you might be asking yourself, okay, we're talking all about this wording of questions, but what makes a good question? I'm going to address it the other way. I'm going to tell us what makes a bad question so that you know what makes a bad question in a survey so that we can address it and be able to make a good question. So there's three aspects that are most common when writing survey questions that lead to what a bad question is. The first is a bad question is a leading question. Next, bad questions are double-barreled. Third of all, bad questions are negatively worded. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. Your book really dug into how negatively worded questions are always bad. I'm a little bit in disagreement, so I'm going to express my opinions on when a negatively worded question can actually be good. However, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into all of these things that make a bad question in survey research. So let's start off. Bad questions are leading questions. So what's a leading question? A leading question is a question that prompts or encourages a desired answer. So let's look at these examples of leading questions. It says, in general, how healthy are you? So that's a leading question in the sense that it uses that adjective of healthy, right? You have led the reader of the question to think that they're already healthy in that format. So we can use alternative formatting and to change it so that it says, in general, how would you rate your health? It's a much better sounding worded question and doesn't make any assumptions of the participant or reader of this question. Another example of a leading question is, to what extent do you agree with each of the following statements? There's a problem with that because someone can also disagree with that exact statement. So we need to include all aspects of the question so that a reader doesn't have this assumption in their head that they're meant to agree with it. So an alternative wording to that question is, to what extent do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements? So it's very important with your questions that you have all aspects of agreeance or in some way associated with it. If you're asking a question of how strong or weak someone is, say how strong or weak are you, not just how strong are you. And then lastly, this is probably the biggest misleading question mistake that you can do, but take this one, for example, where this question states, we encourage employees to enhance their skills. Would you be interested in receiving training? That's pretty interesting. You've started off the question by stating that employees are encouraged to enhance their skills. So you've already set an expectation of the reader. The way that we can avoid that with some alternative wording is to say, please rate your interest in receiving training. So you've essentially taken out that leading language that assumes that the reader has to enhance their skills and eliminates this bias, and it allows for an increase in construct validity by doing this. Next, bad questions are double-barreled. A double-barreled question is a question that touches upon two issues but only allows for one answer. So think about this. If you are asking two questions but are only allowing for one answer, that's a problem with the way that you're stating your question, right? And to the left here, we have an example of what a double-barreled question looks like. So take, for example, have you cut back on eating fats because you are concerned about heart disease and a stroke? Well, you just asked the participant two different questions and only expected one response. Therefore, there's disclarification as to what the response actually means. Are they cutting back on fats because they're concerned about heart disease? Are they cutting back on fats because they're concerned about a stroke? Or it could be both. So in reality, you don't know what the participant is responding to. So alternatively, you can ask this in two separate questions in which you say, have you cut back on eating because you are concerned in one, heart disease, end the question there, and then go on to the next question. You say, have you cut back on eating fats because you are concerned about two, stroke? So essentially the main point of this slide is to entail that when you're writing a question, it's essential that you avoid double-barreled questions. And if you take a survey research class, you'll learn all about the different ways that these go. And sometimes I've even written research survey questions where they are double-barreled. It's actually sometimes in here, it's quite obvious as to that this is double-barreled, but sometimes it's a lot more vague than is mentioned here. Next, we talk about how bad questions are negatively worded. Your book really gets into detail about why negatively worded questions are so bad. I personally disagree with this. I think there are options in which negatively worded questions can be good. However, I think that this is better phrased as good questions are clearly worded. So it's quite obvious that a negatively worded question can cause confusion in an individual. For example, are there times when you are not happy? Could be more confusing than are there times when you are sad? Obviously, are there times when you are sad would be the better way to word a question. However, oftentimes, and you'll learn this if you take a measurement class sometimes, when measuring a construct, so for example, remember a construct is a variable that we have taken and turned operationalized so that it can be measured now. However, so when measuring a construct such as depression, it is encouraged to have negatively worded questions in your measure. So just keep that in mind. Although they're negatively worded is not encouraged, it's oftentimes encouraged that you do have 1 to 2 negatively worded questions. It additionally is a great way to make sure that your reader is indeed reading the survey of interest. If you had one question that said, how often are you happy? And the next question says, how often are you sad? And they responded something like strongly agree to both of those or something like that, or a 5 less than every day they're sad and every day they're happy. Well, which is it? So it gives you actually a good indication as to this reader might not be taking my survey seriously. So there's a lot of actually advantages to having a negatively worded question every now and then. However, the majority of your worded questions should be positively worded. And I also wanted to state here that double negatives in a survey are never okay though. So you will never not do something like that, make a double negative. You will always, instead of saying, do you never not do something, you say, do you always do something? Double negatives are never okay in a survey research. Another interesting aspect of surveys that is often talked about is question order. Earlier questions may impact later responses on a survey. If you talk about sensitive questions at the beginning, it may encourage a respondent to not want to take your survey and end the survey early. So oftentimes, one way that we go through this is we have different versions of the survey or randomize our question survey. However, I do want this to be noted. If you are going to randomize questions, there shouldn't be a hodgepodge of questions. You should follow some sort of logical flow that your reader of the survey can sincerely go by. For example, you don't want to have your demographics mixed in with depression questions. You want a section for demographics, a section for depression items, a section for anxiety items, a section for some other set of items as well. That should be in a logical flow that makes more sense to the reader of your survey. And one last point with question order that I wanted to make is that in reality, whenever you are conducting a survey, it's always important to have sensitive questions go near the end of the survey. So, for example, if you are asking questions about depression, which can be sensitivity, especially if you're asking questions about things like suicidality, questions like that should be at the end of the survey. The reason for this is because those questions may cause distress and cause your survey taker to not want to take the survey anymore, which they have every right to stop taking the survey whenever they feel like it. However, the nice thing about putting sensitive questions near the end of the survey is you have the rest of the survey already completed. So it's just a little trick that is oftentimes used for question order. I additionally always like to have my demographics at the beginning. I think demographics are one of the most important aspects that we should have about every single participant. There's a lot to do with that with missing data. If you have demographic characteristics before the rest of the survey, if they decide to stop taking the survey halfway through, it's really important to have that demographic information. So overall, I feel that it's necessary to state that we can trust participants to provide us honest answers. However, there are problems we need to think about with self-report data. And we're going to discuss those problems in more detail. The two problems that I see most often cited in the literature or in textbooks are response sets, which is known as this idea of acquiescence and fence-sitting responses, and then additionally desirable responding. So let's go ahead and talk about the first problem with participant responding, which is response sets. Response sets are when a participant answers a question simply to get the survey done. So this is really mostly a concern when you have a long, lengthy survey or if you're working with certain populations. For example, I work with adolescent and youth populations, and it's a true fact that youth honestly don't like to take surveys. Therefore, I have to constantly worry about response sets. Imagine when somebody simply just writes strongly agree to every single question without actually reading the question. That's a response set. In which somebody is using shortcuts of some sort in order to get through your survey and hand it in back to you. Like I said, this is mostly a concern with certain populations as well as lengthy surveys. For example, surveys that take more than 15 minutes to complete are when you have to start worrying for response sets. Two different types of response sets that also exist are acquiescence and fence-sitting. Acquiescence is this idea of yay saying. This is when a participant tends to agree with items or marks the positive of the items most often. These are oftentimes more agreeable participants who will always mark yes to some sort of set of problems. So they tend to be in a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. They tend to strongly agree with all statements. Fence sitting is those that answer in the middle of the scale. As to be not acquiescent actually in the terms. This is actually quite the opposite of acquiescence. These are individuals who, in a scale from strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree, or even with the presence of a neutral item, will tend to respond as a neutral the most case because they can't make up a choice of whether they want to be yes or no. So there's three different characteristics of response sets. One is where a participant is just trying to get through your survey, so they answer all the questions in one way just to get the survey over with. The next is acquiescence, which is where a participant tends to strongly agree or say yes to most of your items. And then lastly, we have fence sitting, where an individual tends to answer in the middle of the scale. Next, we can talk about desirable responding. Desirable responding comes in two parts. There's the idea of faking good. This is when a respondent provides answers that intentionally makes them look good. For example, oftentimes if we were to give surveys to prisoner populations, what happens most of the time is that prisoner populations tend to make themselves look really good. So if you ask them a question saying something like, "I never lie," it has been shown that in prisoner populations, they oftentimes will state that they never lie in order to fake that they look good. Additionally, there's the other side of that coin as well, in which they're faking bad. Faking bad is when a respondent provides answers that intentionally makes them look bad. This is often the case in diagnosing surveys, so things from the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual 4 surveys that are actually set to diagnose a disease, in which somebody wants to seem like they actually have some sort of disease of interest. This could be because they just want to have the disease. Maybe there's some benefits associated with having the disease of interest. So take, for example, in a scale or measurement that is associated with schizophrenia, in which I asked someone questions about schizophrenia. For example, are you having hallucinations? Are you having auditory hallucinations? Do you have some sort of hallucination in general? This person could fake bad and say they're having hallucinations even though they're not having them at all, as a way to make themselves look bad. So one solution that we've come up to kind of get over this faking good or faking bad are social desirability scales. These are, or items. Social desirability items or scales are essentially items that indicate things that are impossible to have. So for example, a question like, "I never do anything wrong," is an indication of a social desirability item. Clearly, people who are answering honestly do things wrong every now and then and are accepting of that. However, if you are trying to be socially desirable, the idea is that you will respond to this item in a way that makes you seem socially desirable, in which you will indicate that you never do anything wrong, which is clearly impossible. We're all human. We all do things wrong. We all know it. Therefore, this, if people are indicating questions such as that, it clearly indicates that they're potentially lying to you on their responses. So in summary, there are a lot of important considerations when designing a survey. You have to think about response type, question phrasing, and question order as well. If you do anything unique or anything associated with these really lead to bias. And remember, in any type of research, we can't get rid of bias, but these are things to think about that may lead to different types of biases in general. Construct validity is also everything that you need to be concerned about in survey research. You're essentially the whole time wondering, am I actually measuring my variable of interest? That's the really important aspect, because remember, this is the idea of operationalization, in which we're leading a conceptual variable to measure it through survey items, and there's a lot of bias and questions that come up when we're measuring an operationalized variable. Now we're going to move on to Unit 15, in which we're going to be talking about observational research. And I just want to put a quick disclaimer here as well. Observational research is a large topic field, and we are only going to cover so much of it in such a little bit of time. But I want to give you some exposure to observational research, especially because in Psych 350, you're not going to be as exposed to survey and observational research methodologies, but rather you'll be focusing on the statistics associated with analyzing observational and survey research. So our objectives for today in observational research is to explain what observational research is. Then we're going to understand the different ways to perform observational research. And additionally, we're going to account for biases that come with observational research. And again, as you can see, as I always state, there's always biases associated with research, and there's just more biases that we need to account for and accept that are going to be within our research methods. What is observational research? Observational research is when a researcher watches people or animals and systematically records how they behave or what they are doing. This allows the researcher to observe people in their natural environments, something that survey and experimental researcher can't do. So before we are questioning the validity of asking people questions in survey research. However, in observational research, we're actually more questioning the validity of the researcher themselves. Does a researcher have the objective ability to properly define and operationalize variables that they are observing in the natural environments? And there's ways that we can go about to determine whether they are, and if they aren't, ways that we can improve the ability to be more objective in a natural environment. There's two ways to perform observational research. The first is a directly observing observational research. This is live and in the moment when the researcher is live with the participants recording behavioral observations. So they can either be out in the streets observing somebody stopping at a stop sign and tallying how often they do that stop sign. Additionally, at seeing how often somebody smiles in the middle of a conversation would be a direct way of looking into observational research. There is additionally the indirect way of performing observational research. In the indirect method of performing observational research, we're using technology to record participants, such as a video camera, an audio recorder, and making observations from that. Now, as you can see, and you can probably already think about, there's clearly advantages and disadvantages to each. Of directly observing an individual, there becomes a lot of characteristics of an observer coming into the environment that come into play. When an observer is observing people, do people act the same when the observer is in the environment with them? Or conversely, with indirect, you lose a lot of aspects associated with live and in the moment recording. Let's say something happens to the side of the camera or something gets picked up wrongly from the audio recording. That's a disadvantage that you experience with indirect observation. However, it's great because there's no one in the environment and people are acting in a more systematic or natural way from the observational research. So really, there's advantages and disadvantages to whether you do a direct observational research or an indirect observational research. In this unit, we're going to talk all about operationalization. In observational research, we're clearly operationalizing a conceptual variable through observation. And with this, whenever we operationalize a variable, there becomes a lot of bias associated with it as well. Two of the biases that we're going to be talking about today are observer bias and reactivity. And in the next set of slides, I'm going to discuss these biases in greater detail and strategies to avoid it. So let's first talk about observer bias. Observer bias occurs when observers' expectations influence their interpretation of the participants' behaviors or the outcome of the study. So essentially, this is when the observer is turning an objective process into a subjective process. So we really have to question a lot with observational research is how much of this is subjectively coming from the observer themselves and how much is this an objective process. It should be systematic, it should be objective. However, any time a researcher is performing the study themselves without a self-report from the participant, you have to question how well is that observer clearly defining the construct of interest, clearly measuring the variable, and many things. There's three ways that I can think of off the top of my head and that your book mentioned to avoid observer bias. The first way is to train your observers. Train observers for the best way to observe the certain constructs of interest. For example, if I was interested in how many times someone smiles in a conversation, it would be really beneficial for me to define to my observers what a smile is, how to clearly define a smile. Or, if I was observing how often people stop at a stop sign, it's to clearly define how well what stopping at a stop sign clearly means. Does it mean stopped at the stop sign for a minimum of 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds? What does a California stop count as? Um, Additionally, it's always important to use multiple observers. It's not going to completely eliminate your bias. However, it will help to control for your biases and to understand how much bias exists. If you have multiple observers, you're able to get inter-rater reliability. Remember we learned about inter-rater reliability before, in which we can calculate things like Cohen's kappa to measure how much agreement there is between our observing raters. Additionally, one more strategy you can use to avoid this observer bias, or to at least reduce it, because we can never completely eliminate it, is to make your study a masked design, otherwise known as a blind design. A masked design means that the observers that are observing the constructs of interest have no idea what the research question is. This is important because then they can't have any biases associated with the research questions or the hypotheses within it. If an observer is blind to the research question or hypotheses of interest, then we know that that couldn't have taken an account into their observations. Next concept we're going to talk about is reactivity. Reactivity is when your participants in the observational study change their behaviors because they know that they're being watched. So there's a few ways to get around this. The first way to avoid this reactivity bias is to blend in with your environment. If possible, blend in, be a chameleon. If you're recording the amount of times someone stops at a stop sign, make it clear that you're not watching them. Make it clear that it looks like you're doing something else, but clearly you're trying to record what they're doing. Another thing is called waiting it out, in which you go into the environment and essentially see how long you just blend in there for a while until the participants become comfortable with your presence. I find this is often the case in which observational research happens in the schools. Oftentimes before an observational researcher will perform their observational research in a school, they'll become one with the school and an entity and kind of walk around with the school in order to get the students more comfortable with them being around and observing them. Then once after some sort of grace period, let's say it could be 1 to 2 weeks, they start the observational recording. This observational recording will hopefully be more accurate as the reactivity dies down, so participants are used to your presence in the environment. Lastly, another way to avoid reactivity of biases is to actually avoid measuring the participants at all. Rather, you measure the behaviors that are antecedent to the participants being there. For example, let's say, I'm interested in, just off the top of my head, I'm interested in the way that how much drinking happens in a fraternity house. Rather than going into the fraternity house and measuring the alcohol consumption by looking at the number of individuals that drinks that an individual takes, I could rather go to the trash can the next day and view how many beer bottles are in the trash can in order to get the results from the behavior. As you can see from there, as opposed to measuring the actual behavior of interest, I measured the results that come from the behavior of interest. Therefore, I can count the number of beer bottles in the trash can to see how much drinking occurred in the fraternity house. So in summary, I know that was a really short introduction to observational research, but it's important to understand that observational research is a systematic process. Additionally, there are multiple ways to perform observational research. The operationalization that comes with observational research also comes with biases, those biases being observer bias and reactivity bias. There are ways to control for these biases depending on the research variable and the research question, but you'll never be able to absolutely eliminate the biases that come with it.